They tell you fairy tales about princesses, about white veils and glittering crowns, about gallant kings and weddings that last till death do them part. But they don't tell you about Isabelle. They don't tell you about the 6-year-old girl who was sold for a treaty, about the wedding dress that weighed more than she did, about the scream that shattered the ceremony in St. Paul's Cathedral, or the night she spent alone in a bed meant for a king. I'm going to tell you now. Subscribe if you believe no child deserves to be sacrificed for power. Because this is one horror story the history books tried to bury. In the shimmering candlelight of St. Paul's Cathedral, a girl in gold stumbled down the aisle. 6 years old, a dress of silk and jewels so heavy it left bruises on her shoulders. Isabelle of France, daughter of a mad king, pawn of a merciless mother, and in a few minutes, Queen of England. The organ thundered through the Gothic nave, nobles from 2 warring kingdoms watching, not with pity, but with calculation. At the altar stood Richard II, a man of 29, elegant, refined, and desperate. England was broke, his nobles restless, his enemies circling. Peace was a necessity, and a 6-year-old bride was the price. As she walked, Isabelle clutched a small wooden doll, the one thing she was allowed to keep from home. Her face was pale, her eyes glassy. She didn't understand treaties, but she understood fear. And she screamed, a piercing cry that cut through the music. Witnesses would later claim it was a tantrum, a child's nerves. But they were lying. It was the scream of a little girl being handed to a man old enough to be her father. And no one stopped it. Subscribe now if you believe Isabelle deserved love, not politics. These are the forgotten stories they don't want told. The negotiations for Isabelle's hand hadn't happened in secret. They took place in grand halls, at mahogany tables, with men in velvet robes, grown men haggling over the body of a 6-year-old. The English delegation hesitated. Even by medieval standards, 6 was appallingly young. But the French had an argument ready, an argument so monstrous it should haunt every history book. They told the English lords, "Take her young. She will grow to love only English customs. She will grow to belong to you, to him." They were speaking of Richard II. Before the ink dried on the treaty, the English demanded to inspect her, like livestock. A procession of nobles paraded Isabelle before foreign eyes. They examined her teeth, her skin, her posture. One English lord was overheard murmuring, "She will ripen beautifully." She was 6. The dowry agreed upon was obscene. 800,000 livres, enough to fund wars, build castles, fill a bankrupt treasury. But the cruelest detail lay in a single, carefully worded clause in the marriage contract. While the union would remain unconsummated until a proper age, Richard II would have all other rights of a husband immediately. The right to decide where she lived, what she wore, who she spoke to, whether she was alone with him. the right to lay beside her as she slept. They signed away her life with a stroke of a quill. And when they told Isabel she would be Queen of England, her only question was, "May I bring my dolls?" No one told her no, but no one intended to let her keep them. The farewell ceremony at the Louvre was a masterpiece of cruelty disguised as pageantry. Isabel's father, King Charles VI of France, was lucid for once, the madness that plagued him briefly gone. He held his daughter so tightly they had to pry his arms open. Servants swore he whispered something in her ear that made her sob so violently her little crown slipped. We will never know what a mad king said to his 6-year-old child bride on the day she was sold. As the carriages departed Paris, Isabel clutched the small wooden doll she'd been promised she could bring. But the journey was a nightmare. 2 weeks of cold, bone-rattling roads, towns where strangers stared, soldiers who watched her like a thing, not a person. The little girl barely ate, barely spoke. At night she wept, too exhausted to scream. Her French attendants, governesses who'd raised her from birth, began to despair. At one stop in a rain-soaked village, a priest tried to bless the child. She wouldn't lift her head, wouldn't meet his gaze. She just whispered, "I want to go home." But home was already a memory. When they reached Calais, the scene resembled a battlefield's aftermath. A massive tent city built for the exchange. Silk pavilions flying English banners. Musicians, acrobats, and feasts no one enjoyed. At the center of a muddy field, 2 delegations met. Isabel was led to the exact center. Gold changed hands. Latin words were spoken. A contract passed between trembling fingers. And just like that, she belonged to England. What followed was worse. Her French ladies were dismissed, weeping openly. Even her beloved dog, promised safe passage, was taken away. The last familiar voice, her governess, whispered, "God be with you, my little heart," before being dragged back toward the French pavilions. Isabel was alone, and the road ahead led straight to London, straight to a wedding night. London, November 1396. The city had never seen a spectacle like it. Every church bell in London rang. The Thames was crowded with decorated barges. Westminster Palace gleamed with banners of crimson and gold. A child was about to become queen, and no one tried to stop it. St. Paul's Cathedral had been transformed into a fever dream. Thousands of candles, walls draped in gold cloth, an altar so heavily decorated it looked like a shrine to greed itself. At its center stood Richard II, tall, pale, elegant, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. But he wasn't nervous about marrying a child. He was nervous about politics. Would this buy him peace? Would it crush his rivals? Would the French pay the dowry in full? The morality of it, that never crossed his mind. And then Isabel appeared, so small the ceremonial robes dragged behind her. The specially made crown slipped on her hair. 2 ladies had to hold the train of her gown. The crowd gasped, not in admiration, in shock. The Archbishop of Canterbury knelt to her height, asked if she consented. She didn't answer, couldn't. An English lady in waiting bent low and whispered the words in her ear. And Isabelle of France, 6 years old, whispered, "I will," 2 words that condemned her to a lifetime of captivity. The ring wouldn't fit, had to be forced onto her tiny finger. She winced. No one stopped. The kiss of peace, a traditional kiss upon the lips, was mercifully altered. Richard kissed her forehead, but when he touched her, witnesses swore they saw her flinch. And then it was done. The crowd cheered. Coins were hurled into the street, and a little girl stood at the altar, tears streaming silently down her face, as strangers celebrated the worst day of her life. If this story already makes your skin crawl, subscribe now. Not for me, for Isabelle, so she isn't forgotten again. Hit like, share this nightmare, because history only repeats when we stay silent. If you thought the cruelty ended at the altar, you were mistaken. In medieval courts, even the knight was weaponized. The bedding ceremony was not an option. It was a public rite, a grotesque performance for nobles and clergy alike. The bride would be undressed by her ladies, blessed by a priest, placed in the marriage bed, and the groom would join her. The courtiers would watch. Not the consummation, not even they were that depraved, but the ritual itself, a display of possession, of dominance, of political theater. So Isabelle was led through the stone corridors to the royal chamber, her little feet dragging, her doll clutched so tightly the paint wore from its face. At the doorway, a priest blessed her. Another noble placed a hand on her shoulder. And then she was laid in a massive bed with silken sheets heavy as chainmail. And then came Richard. In his night robe, his face pale and gaunt, a faint tremor in his hand. Witnesses would later claim the king spoke kindly to her, that he smiled, that he even knelt beside the bed. But kindness means little when you're 6 years old and terrified. The courtiers watched as he climbed in beside her. The curtains were drawn, and then the room was empty. What happened next is a silence that history keeps too politely. Richard later swore, before God and Parliament, that the marriage was never consummated, and there is no proof to the contrary. But the next morning, her ladies found Isabelle huddled in a corner of the enormous bed, tears streaking her face, her voice gone. She did not speak for 3 days. When she finally did, it was in French, the only language her terror remembered. "When can I go home?" Of course, no one answered, because the truth was never. After the wedding, London returned to its business. The nobles counted their coins. The clergy blessed their own cleverness. And Isabelle, 6 years old, a child queen, was left to endure the days no one ever wrote about. She was moved to Windsor Castle, an imposing fortress of cold stone and colder faces. Richard, to his credit or cunning, gave her a household of French-speaking attendants. He showered her with gifts, not jewels or gowns, but toys, books, and a small white pony she named Blanche. It might sound like kindness. It wasn't. It was grooming. It was a predator teaching his captive to stay close. She learned English, was paraded through banquets and ceremonies like a well-dressed pet. Foreign ambassadors remarked how well-trained she was, how she could already recite English poems and perform courtly dances. But behind palace walls, the reality was harrowing. The English court despised her. Some hated the enormous dowry her marriage had cost. Others sneered at the French brat who now sat beside their king. And then there were the lecherous jokes, whispered by drunken lords, about when the little queen would be fit for breeding. One banquet chronicler left a note, rarely mentioned in modern accounts. A noble, well into his wine, made a crude comment about the queen's readiness. The hall erupted in laughter. Isabelle, too young to grasp the implication, but old enough to sense humiliation, burst into tears and fled the room. Richard had the man flogged nearly to death, but the culture that allowed such cruelty never changed. And night after night, in her enormous empty bed, Isabelle clutched her wooden doll, spoke to the walls in French, and waited for a rescue that would not come. If you believe history should remember the victims, not just the victors, subscribe now. Like this video for Isabelle. Share it, because every time we forget, the cycle repeats. By the time Isabelle turned 7, she had already learned the essential lesson of medieval queenship. You are property. You are pawn. And no one will come to save you. The English court grew colder. The dowry long spent. The novelty of the French child bride faded. Isabelle began writing letters home. To her mother. To her half-mad father. To the French court that had sold her. The fragments that survive are tiny acts of rebellion, scribbled in uncertain Latin and careful French, hidden between official correspondences. One letter reads, "I pray for you daily. I am well treated, but my heart remains in France." Another, heartbreakingly childlike, "Do you still remember me? I fear you have forgotten your Isabelle." And then there was the letter no one meant to find, discovered years later, hidden between the pages of a religious text in her chamber. It was addressed not to her mother, not to her father, but to Richard. "They say you are dead, but I do not believe it. You promised to protect me always. I wait for you still. Your Isabelle." A 7-year-old widow, writing to a dead king. The only person who, in her young mind, had offered even a trace of safety in a monstrous world. The court ignored her grief, ignored her loneliness. They ignored her entirely until it became politically inconvenient to do so. By the time Isabelle turned 10, England was collapsing into rebellion. Richard II's rule had become tyrannical. Nobles exiled, parliament dismissed, taxes drained. And then, one day, everything shattered. Henry Bolingbroke raised an army. Richard's allies abandoned him, and within weeks, the king, who had married a child for politics, became a prisoner in his own kingdom. Isabelle watched him dragged away in chains, screaming his name, tears blurring her sight. The only person in that cold foreign country who had ever called her my child. And now, he too was gone. No one told her where he was taken. No one told her when or how he died. But in the dim hours of dawn, she somehow felt it. A silence in her chest, where once there had been hope. Isabelle was no longer a queen. Now she was a problem. Henry IV's regime had no use for a French girl with a foreign dowry already spent. Returning her meant repaying debts they no longer had the gold for. So they did what men in power have always done with inconvenient women. They locked her away. At Havering Palace, gilded walls became a prison. Letters censored, visitors forbidden. And for 3 long years, from 10 to 13, the years when children should be laughing, growing, living, Isabelle rotted in captivity. Her letters turned darker. I am forgotten by all. One reads, I speak to the walls in French, so I do not forget the sound. But the world forgot her anyway. Until one day, across the channel, a mad king had a moment of clarity. Her father, Charles VI of France, the glass man, the king of shadows, remembered he had a daughter lost in England. And for one brief, furious hour of sanity, he roared for her return. It worked. In 1401, at 13, Isabelle came home. But Paris was no longer home. Her mother barely looked at her. Her father, by then again mad, did not recognize the girl whose life he'd sold. Isabelle of France, the 6-year-old bride, the forgotten queen, the ghost of England, was married off again by 16. Died at 20. Of illness, yes, but truly of exhaustion. A lifetime's worth of grief in just 2 decades. And the court chroniclers? They spared her 3 lines. 3 lines to summarize the life of a girl who had screamed for her father at her wedding and been met with silence. If Isabelle's story shook you, if you believe her name deserves to be spoken, not buried, then subscribe now. Like this video so no other child bride of history is erased. Share this story because forgetting is the fastest way to let it happen again.